I remember the day my mother called with that particular tone in her voice, the one that meant she was about to ask me for something I wouldn't want to give. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I was just leaving my office building, the crisp autumn air, a welcome relief after being cooped up all day. "Ruby, sweetheart." Her voice was honey sweet through the phone. "How are you doing?" "I'm good, Mom. Just got off work." I shifted my bag to my other shoulder and started walking toward the subway station. "What's up?" There was a brief pause. "Well, I was wondering if you had a minute to talk about Jake." My stomach knotted immediately. Jake, my younger brother, by 3 years, had a talent for creating problems and an even greater talent for avoiding responsibility for them. At 26, he still lived like he was in college, working just enough to get by and spending most of his money on whatever gave him immediate gratification. "What's he done now?" I asked, unable to keep the wariness from my voice. "That's not fair, Ruby," my mother chided. "He hasn't done anything. He's just going through a rough patch." I stopped walking and closed my eyes. The flow of pedestrians divided around me like a stream around a rock. Define rough patch. He's been let go from his job at the bar, and his landlord raised the rent. He can't afford his apartment anymore. Of course, classic Jake, always one step away from disaster, always needing someone to bail him out. And I could already tell where this conversation was heading. "Mom, I know what you're going to say," she interrupted, "but he really has nowhere else to go. Your father and I would take him in, but you know how small our place is since we downsized. I started walking again, faster now." "What about his friends? Surely one of them—" "Ruby." Her voice hardened just enough to let me know she was serious. "He's your brother." Those 3 words, "he's your brother," had been used against me my entire life. Whenever Jake broke my toys, "He's your brother, Ruby, share with him." When he read my diary and told everyone at school about my crush, "He's your brother, Ruby, forgive him." When he borrowed my car in college and returned it, with an empty tank and a dent in the fender, "He's your brother, Ruby, be understanding." I sighed. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Well, you still have that little apartment on Cedar Street, don't you? The one you rent out sometimes?" The knot in my stomach tightened. Yes, I did still have that apartment. It was my first real estate purchase, a tiny 1-bedroom that I'd bought 5 years ago when the market was down. I'd lived there until last year when I'd scraped together enough for a down payment on a slightly larger place closer to work. Now I rented out the Cedar Street apartment, and the income helped cover both mortgages. It's occupied right now. I lied. "Oh." My mother sounded disappointed, but not convinced. "Jake said he thought your tenants moved out last month." Damn it, Jake. He'd always been too observant when it came to things that might benefit him. They did, but I have new people. Moving in next week. Another lie, Ruby. There was that tone again, equal parts disappointment and expectation. "I know you and Jake have had your differences, but he's really trying this time. He just needs a little help to get back on his feet." I reached the subway entrance and paused at the top of the stairs. People rushed past me, heading home to families, and dinners and normal evening routines that didn't involve being guilted into housing irresponsible siblings. "How long?" I asked, already hating myself for giving in. I could hear the relief in my mother's voice. "Just until he finds a new job and saves up for a security deposit. 3 months? Tops. 3 months. 90 days of worrying about what Jake might be doing to my property. 90 days of lost rental income. 90 days of feeling like I was enabling his inability to grow up." "I need to think about it," I said finally. "Of course, sweetheart. Just don't think too long, okay? His lease is up at the end of the week." After we hung up, I stood there for a few more minutes, watching people stream past me, all of them moving purposefully toward their destinations while I felt stuck in place. I'd worked so hard to build my life, graduated with honors, secured a good job at a marketing firm, saved carefully, invested wisely. Jake had done none of those things, and yet here I was, considering sacrificing part of what I'd built to bail him out. Again. The worst part was, I knew I'd say yes. Not because I believed Jake deserved my help, but because saying no would mean endless guilt trips from my parents and strained family gatherings for months to come. The path of least resistance was to help him, set clear boundaries, and hope that this time somehow would be different. I finally descended into the subway, the familiar musty scent and rumble of approaching trains grounding me. I'd call my mother tomorrow and tell her Jake could stay at the apartment for 3 months, not a day longer, and only if he agreed to my rules. I'd make a contract, get everything in writing. This time, I promised myself I wouldn't let him take advantage of me. But even as I made this resolution, a voice in the back of my mind whispered that I was making a mistake. That voice sounded suspiciously like my best friend, Zoe, who had watched me clean up Jake's messes for years and had never been shy about telling me I needed to let him face the consequences of his actions. "You're not helping him," she told me once. "You're just teaching him that he doesn't need to be responsible because someone will always save him." As the subway car lurched forward, taking me home, I wondered if she was right. And I wondered how much I would regret saying yes to my mother's request. 3 days later, I stood in the middle of my Cedar Street apartment, giving it one last inspection before Jake arrived. The place was small but efficient, an open-concept living area and kitchen, 1 bedroom with a decent closet, and a bathroom with a shower but no tub. The furnishings were minimal but functional: a futon sofa, a coffee table, a small dining set, and basic kitchen essentials. In the bedroom was a full-sized bed, a dresser, and a nightstand. I'd spent the morning cleaning, even though the apartment had been professionally cleaned after the last tenants moved out. It gave me something to do with my nervous energy. Now, as I ran a finger along the countertop and found it dust-free, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Be there in 10. Thanks again, Rubes." I grimaced at the nickname. He knew I hated it, which was probably why he used it. I'd sent him a detailed email outlining my expectations. No parties, no damage to the property, utilities would be his responsibility, and he needed to actively search for employment. I'd also made it clear that this arrangement was temporary, 3 months maximum. Jake had responded with a thumbs-up emoji and "No prob, sis, I owe you one." He owed me several, actually, but who was counting? The sound of a car door slamming drew me to the window. Jake was climbing out of an Uber, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and 2 cardboard boxes stacked in his arms. He looked up at the building, and for a moment, I saw vulnerability in his expression, something rare for my usually overconfident brother. The sight tugged at my heart despite my reservations. Maybe he really was trying this time. Maybe he really did just need a temporary hand-up, not another handout. I went downstairs to help him with his things, and we awkwardly maneuvered the boxes up the narrow staircase to the second-floor apartment. "Is this everything?" I asked when we'd set the boxes down in the living room. Jake nodded. "Sold most of my stuff when I knew I couldn't keep the apartment. No point in paying for storage, right?" I was surprised by his practicality. "Right." He looked around the apartment with appreciation. "This is nice, Ruby. Really nice. I promise I'll take good care of it." "I know you will," I said, hoping it was true. "I've got the agreement for you to sign, just the stuff I emailed you about." I pulled the document from my bag and handed it to him. He skimmed it quickly, too quickly, in my opinion, and then signed at the bottom. 3 months, he said, handing it back to me. "By then, I'll have a new job and my own place. You won't regret this." I'd heard similar promises from him before, but something about his demeanor seemed different this time. There was a seriousness in his eyes that I wasn't used to seeing. I gave him a set of keys and showed him around the apartment, pointing out things he'd need to know: how to adjust the thermostat, which day was trash collection, the finicky nature of the bathroom sink, faucet. "I've stocked the fridge with some basics," I told him as we ended our tour in the kitchen. just to get you started." "You didn't have to do that," he said, but his appreciative smile told me he was glad I had. "It's no big deal." I shrugged. "Oh, and I left the Wi-Fi password on the fridge. The utilities are in my name, but I've set it up so the bills will come to you. You can pay them online." Jake nodded, looking a bit overwhelmed. "Got it." An awkward silence fell between us. Despite being siblings, we'd never been particularly close. The 3-year age gap had felt like a chasm when we were growing up, and his tendency to create chaos in my carefully ordered world hadn't helped. "Well," I said finally, "I should get going. Let me know if you need anything." "Actually," Jake said, stopping me as I turned to leave, "I was thinking maybe we could grab dinner sometime this week. My treat, as a thank you." The offer surprised me. "Sure," I said after a moment. "That would be nice." He smiled, and for a second, I saw the little brother I'd once adored before years of disappointment had soured our relationship. "Great. I'll text you." As I left the apartment, I felt a cautious optimism. Maybe this arrangement wouldn't be the disaster I feared. Maybe Jake really was growing up at last. But as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was forgetting something important, some protection I should have put in place, some rule I should have established. I pushed the worry aside. The agreement was clear, and Jake seemed genuinely grateful and committed to making this work. What could possibly go wrong? The first month went surprisingly well. Jake found a job as a bartender at a place downtown within the first week, and he paid the first month's utilities on time. We met for dinner as promised, and he actually paid, choosing a modest restaurant. That wouldn't strain his budget. He talked about his plans to save money and take some online classes to improve his job prospects. For once, he didn't ask me for anything beyond what I'd already given him. I started to think that maybe this time really was different. Maybe hitting rock bottom, losing his job and apartment in the same month, had been the wake-up call he saw needed. I even found myself bragging a little to Zoe about how well he was doing. "I'm glad it's working out," she said when we met for our weekly coffee date, but I could tell she was reserving judgment. "Just be careful, Ruby. Old patterns are hard to break." "I know, but he seems different this time," I insisted, "more mature." Zoe raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more, changing the subject to her upcoming vacation. I should have listened to her skepticism. I should have remembered that with Jake, periods of responsibility were usually just the calm before the storm. The first sign of trouble came 6 weeks into our arrangement. I'd stopped by the apartment unannounced to drop off some mail that had been delivered to my place by mistake. I'd texted Jake to let him know I was coming, but he hadn't responded. I figured he was at work, so I used my key to let myself in. The apartment wasn't in terrible condition, but it wasn't in great shape either. Dishes were piled in the sink, takeout containers littered the coffee table, and there was an empty wine bottle on the floor beside the futon. None of this was outrageous for a single guy living alone, but it wasn't how I'd left the place. What caught my attention, though, was the pair of women's boots by the door. Small, stylish ankle boots that definitely didn't belong to my brother. Stood there staring at those boots as a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Jake hadn't mentioned dating anyone, but that wasn't unusual. He rarely shared details of his personal life with me. Still, something about those boots bothered me. They looked comfortable, lived in, not like the footwear of someone who had just stopped by for a visit. I continued into the apartment, and more evidence of a female presence emerged. A fluffy pink towel hung in the bathroom, alongside Jake's plain blue one. There was makeup scattered on the bathroom counter. And in the bedroom, the closet door was open, revealing dresses and blouses hanging next to Jake's t-shirts and jeans. Someone was living here with him, someone he hadn't mentioned to me, and who definitely wasn't on our agreement. I was still processing this discovery when I heard a key in the lock. I stepped back into the living room just as the door opened and a young woman walked in. She was petite, with dyed platinum blonde hair, wearing a crop top despite the cool autumn weather, and carrying a paper bag of groceries. She stopped short, When she saw me, her heavily lined eyes widening in surprise. "Oh, hi there." "Hello," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral, even as anger began to simmer beneath the surface. "I'm Ruby, Jake's sister." "And you are?" Her face relaxed into a smile. "I'm Amber, Jake's girlfriend. He's told me so much about you." Had he? Funny, because he'd told me nothing about her. "Nice to meet you," I lied. "Does Jake know you're here?" She set the groceries on the kitchen counter. "He's at work until 6. I just ran out to grab some stuff for dinner." She gestured toward the bag. "I'm making pasta carbonara. You're welcome to stay if you want. There's plenty." Her friendly offer caught me off guard. She seemed so comfortable, so at home in my apartment. How long had this been going on? "No, thank you. I just stopped by to drop off some mail." I placed the envelopes on the counter. "How long have you and Jake been together?" "About 2 months now," she said, beginning to unpack the groceries. "We met at the bar where he works. I'm a server at the restaurant next door." 2 months. So they'd started dating right around the time he moved in. And based on the evidence before me, she'd moved in not long after. "And how long have you been living here?" I asked directly. Amber paused, a jar of pasta sauce in her hand. "Oh, I'm not really living here. I just stay over sometimes." It was a weak lie, and we both knew it. The closet full of her clothes, the toiletries in the bathroom, the feminine touches around the apartment all told a different story. "I see," I said, not pushing the issue for now. "Well, I should get going. Please tell Jake I stopped by." "Sure thing." Her cheeriness returned. "It was really nice to meet you, Ruby." I forced a smile and left, my mind racing. Jake had violated our agreement. He'd moved someone else into my apartment without asking or even informing me. And based on the state of the place, it didn't seem like having a girlfriend living with him was making him more responsible. I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do. The mature thing would be to call Jake, express my concerns calmly, and remind him of our agreement. But part of me wanted to seethe, to let my anger build until I could confront him with the full force of my disappointment. In the end, I decided to give him the chance to come clean. I sent him a text. "Stopped by today to drop off mail. Let's talk soon." His response came quickly. "Thanks. Sure, how about coffee tomorrow morning before my shift?" No mention of Amber, no acknowledgement that I might have met his secret roommate. 11 a.m. at Cornerstone Cafe, I replied, naming a spot near the apartment. "See you then," he texted back with a thumbs-up emoji. I drove home with a heavy feeling in my chest. Just when I thought Jake was changing, he'd fallen back into old patterns, taking what I gave him and then taking more without asking. I'd been a fool to think this time would be different. Zoe's words echoed in my mind. Old patterns are hard to break. I just hoped this particular pattern wouldn't end up costing me more than I was willing to lose. I arrived at the Cornerstone Cafe 10 minutes early the next morning, ordered a latte, and chose a table near the back where we could talk privately. The cafe was busy with the late morning crowd, people working on laptops, friends catching up, a young mother trying to keep her toddler entertained. Jake walked in 5 minutes late, spotted me, and weaved his way through the tables. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes and his dark hair sticking up as if he just rolled out of bed. "Hey," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. "I'm gonna grab a coffee. Want a refill?" I shook my head, and he went to the counter. When he returned with his drink, he took a long sip before meeting my eyes. "So," he said, "what's up?" I decided to be direct. "I met Amber yesterday." Jake's expression flickered, surprise, then resignation. "Yeah, I figured you might have." "Were you planning to tell me about her?" He shrugged. "It just kind of happened, you know? We started dating, and she was having issues with her roommate, so she started staying over more and more." "And now she lives there," I said flatly. "Not officially," Jake hedged. "She still has her name on the lease at her old place. She's just there a lot." I took a deep breath. "Jake, The agreement was for you to live in the apartment. You alone, not you and a girlfriend. I know, but it's not like she's causing any problems. She's clean, she's quiet, and she helps with groceries and stuff. That's not the point. The point is that you didn't ask me. Again, you've put me in a position where I either have to be the bad guy and enforce boundaries, or I have to let you walk all over them. Jake had the grace to look slightly ashamed. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I really like her, Ruby, and she's good for me. She's helping me get my life together. I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard similar claims before. The apartment wasn't in great shape yesterday, Jake. Dishes in the sink, takeout containers everywhere. We both worked late the night before, he said defensively. We were going to clean up last night. And the utilities? Is she contributing to those? Jake shifted uncomfortably. We're figuring all that out. Look, I know I should have talked to you first, but I didn't think it would be a big deal. It's not like the apartment isn't big enough for 2 people. That's not for you to decide, I said, my frustration mounting. It's my property, Jake, my investment, my responsibility. I know, and I appreciate everything you've done for me. I really do. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Just give Amber a chance. You'll like her, I promise. And having her there actually helps me stay on track. She keeps me accountable. I sipped my latte, considering my options. I could insist that Amber move out, but that would create tension and possibly lead to Jake leaving as well before he had a chance to save enough for his own place. Or I could revise our agreement to include Amber, with additional terms to protect myself and my property. If she's going to live there, I said finally, then she needs to be added to our agreement, and the utilities should be split between the 2 of you. Relief washed over Jake's face. Absolutely, that's totally fair. And I want the apartment kept in better condition. No more dishes piling up, no more takeout containers everywhere. We'll keep it spotless, he promised. You won't even recognize the place next time you come over. I wasn't convinced, but I was willing to give him one more chance. I'll draw up a new agreement, I said. Both of you need to sign it. We will. Thank you, Ruby. Really. I nodded, still not entirely comfortable with the situation, but hoping that maybe, just maybe, Jake was right. Maybe Amber was a good influence on him. Maybe having someone to be accountable to would help him grow up a little. As we finished our coffees and prepared to leave, Jake hesitated. There's one more thing, he said cautiously. I braced myself. What? Amber's birthday is in 2 weeks. We were thinking of having a small get-together at the apartment. Nothing crazy, just a few friends. Would that be okay? The request seemed reasonable enough. How many people? 10, maybe 12? Just close friends from work, mostly. I hesitated, remembering past small get-togethers of Jake's that had turned into full-blown parties. But if I was going to trust him with Amber living there, I probably needed to trust him with this too. Fine, I said. But keep it under control. No damage to the apartment, no noise complaints from neighbors. Of course, Jake said quickly. It'll be totally chill. You're welcome to come too, if you want. I'll think about it, I said, though I had no intention of attending. We parted, ways outside the cafe, and I watched Jake walk toward the apartment, my apartment, with a nagging sense of unease. I'd given in again, adjusted my boundaries to accommodate him again. As I walked to my car, I called Zoe. You're not going to believe this, I said when she answered. Jake moved his girlfriend into the apartment without telling me. Zoe's sigh was audible. And let me guess, you're letting them stay. I'm revising the agreement to include her, I said defensively, and adding some stricter conditions. Ruby, Zoe said, her voice gentle but firm. When are you going to stop letting Jake take advantage of you? It's not like that this time, I insisted, though even I didn't fully believe it. And it's only for another month and a half. Then they'll be out. If you say so, Zoe replied, clearly unconvinced. Just promise me you'll be careful. I promise, I said. But as I drove home to draft the new agreement, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made another in a long line of mistakes when it came to my brother. The revised agreement was signed by both Jake and Amber 3 days later. I'd added clauses about maintaining the cleanliness of the apartment, limiting overnight guests, and splitting the utilities evenly. I'd also included a specific statement that no parties or large gatherings were permitted without my prior written approval, with the exception of the already discussed birthday celebration for Amber. Both of them had been exceedingly agreeable when I'd stopped by with the new document. The apartment had been cleaned up considerably, evidence that they were capable of maintaining it properly when motivated. Amber had been warm and friendly, thanking me profusely for being so cool about everything. I know this isn't what you signed up for, she'd said, but I really appreciate you letting me stay. Jake talks about you all the time, how smart and successful you are. I can see why he looks up to you so much. Her words had caught me off guard. Jake, looking up to me? That was news to me. Our relationship had always been more complicated than admiration. But her statement had softened me a little toward her, making me wonder if perhaps she was having a positive influence on my brother after all. For the next 2 weeks, everything seemed to go smoothly. Jake texted me updates about his job, mentioning that he was picking up extra shifts to save more money. The utility bills were paid on time. When I drove by the apartment one evening, it looked quiet and normal from the outside. Then came Amber's birthday celebration. I'd decided not to attend, partly because I still felt uncomfortable about the whole situation, and partly because I had a legitimate work commitment that evening, a dinner with a potential client that had been scheduled. Weeks in advance, the dinner ran late, and it was after 11 p.m. when I checked my phone to find 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, along with a text that read, "Hi, Ruby, this is Mrs. Geller from the apartment below Jake's. There's an extremely loud party happening, and I can't reach the building manager. Can you please help?" My stomach dropped. I immediately called Jake, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried Amber next, with the same result. I excused myself from the dinner, apologizing profusely to the client, and drove directly to the apartment. As I turned onto Cedar Street, I could hear the music from half a block away. My heart rate increased with my mounting anger. When I reached the building, I could see lights flashing in the windows of my apartment, and there were people spilling out onto the small balcony, red plastic cups in hand. Several cars were parked haphazardly along the street, one of them partially blocking a driveway. I stormed up the stairs and pounded on the door. No response. I pounded harder, and finally, the door swung open to reveal a guy I'd never seen before, clearly drunk, a beer in one hand. "Welcome to the party," he shouted over the music. "Who invited you?" "I own this apartment," I said icily, pushing past him. "Where's Jake?" The guy shrugged and wandered off. The scene inside was worse than I'd imagined. There had to be at least 30 people crammed into the small space. The air was thick with smoke, both cigarette and something that smelled suspiciously like marijuana. Empty bottles and cans covered every surface. Someone had spilled a drink on the futon, leaving a large stain. A couple was making out in the corner, perilously close to knocking over a lamp. I spotted Jake in the kitchen, doing shots with a group of people. Amber was nowhere to be seen. "Jake!" I yelled, pushing my way through the crowd. He looked up, his eyes widening when he saw me. "Ruby! Hey! You came after all! Turn off the music," I demanded. "Now." Jake's smile faltered. "Come on, Rubes, it's a party. Amber's birthday, remember? You said it was okay." "I said a small get-together was okay. 10 to 12 people, you said. This is not that." Jake glanced around, seeming to notice for the first time just how many people were there. "Okay, it got a little bigger than we planned, but everyone's having a good time." "Mrs. Geller downstairs is not having a good time," I snapped. "She called me because the noise is so loud. And do you have any idea what time it is?" Jake checked his watch and winced. Shit, I didn't realize it was so late. Turn off the music, I repeated, and start getting people out of here, now. Jake hesitated, but something in my expression must have conveyed my seriousness because he nodded and went to the sound system. The music cut off abruptly, followed by a chorus of disappointed groans. Party's over, everyone, Jake announced. Thanks for coming, but time to clear out. Predictably, people were reluctant to leave. Some argued, others ignored him entirely and continued their conversations. One guy even tried to restart the music before I unplugged the speakers. It took nearly half an hour to clear everyone out. And even then, a few stragglers remained, friends of Amber's who claimed they were too drunk to drive and needed to wait for an Uber. During this process, Amber herself finally appeared, emerging from the bedroom with smudged makeup and disheveled hair. She seemed surprised to see me and quickly put on a contrite expression. "Ruby, I'm so sorry," she slurred, her words running together. The party just kind of exploded. People kept inviting other people, and before we knew it, "Save it," I said, in no mood for excuses. "Just help clean up this mess." By the time the last guests left, it was after 1 a.m. The apartment looked like a disaster zone. Besides the stain on the futon, there were cigarette burns on the coffee table, a cracked bathroom mirror, and what looked like vomit in the kitchen sink. I was beyond furious. "This is completely unacceptable," I told Jake and Amber, who stood before me like children being scolded. "You violated our agreement. You disrespected my property. You disturbed the neighbors." "We'll clean everything up," Jake promised, "and we'll pay for any damages." "You're damn right you will," I said. "And this isn't just about the physical damage. It's about trust, Jake. I trusted you to be responsible, and you've shown me once again that you can't be." Jake flinched at my words. "It was one mistake, Ruby. It got out of hand, but it won't happen again." "You're right, it won't," I agreed, "because I'm giving you 2 weeks to find another place to live." "What?" Jake's face paled. "Ruby, come on, don't overreact." "I'm not overreacting. I'm enforcing the boundaries that you've repeatedly crossed. This arrangement isn't working." "Where are we supposed to go?" Amber chimed in, suddenly looking much more sober. "We can't find a place that quickly." "That's not my problem," I said coldly. "You should have thought about that before turning my apartment into a nightclub." Jake stepped forward, his expression pleading. "Ruby, please. We made a mistake, a big one, but don't throw us out. We'll fix everything, I swear." I hesitated, a lifetime of giving in to Jake's pleas warring with my justified anger. But this time, the damage was too real, the violation too severe. 2 weeks, I repeated firmly, and I'll be checking in daily to make sure the apartment is being properly cleaned and repaired. I left them standing amid the wreckage of their party, feeling both righteous in my decision and terrible for having to make it. As I drove home, I called Zoe, needing to vent despite the late hour. "I told you so," she said after I'd recounted the evening's events. "But I'm proud of you for finally standing up to him." "I don't feel proud," I admitted. "I feel like I failed him somehow." "You didn't fail him, Ruby. He failed you. There's a difference." As I crawled into bed that night, physically and emotionally exhausted, I wondered if Zoe was right. Had I been looking at my relationship with Jake all wrong? Had my attempts to help him actually been enabling his irresponsibility? The question swirled in my mind as I drifted off to sleep, the image of my damaged apartment haunting my dreams. The next morning, I awoke to a series of texts from my mother. "Jake called. He's very upset. What happened?" Of course, Jake had immediately run to our parents. It was his standard move whenever he faced consequences for his actions. Present himself as the victim, get our parents on his side, and use their influence to pressure me into backing down. I called my mother instead of texting back, knowing this conversation needed to happen in real time. "Ruby," she answered on the first ring, her voice tight with concern. "What's going on with Jake? He says you're Evicting him? I am, I confirmed. He violated our agreement in multiple ways, Mom. He moved his girlfriend in without asking. They threw a massive party that disturbed the neighbors and damaged the apartment, and he said it was just a birthday party that got a little out of hand, my mother interrupted. Everyone makes mistakes, Ruby. He's your brother. There it was again, that familiar refrain. He's your brother. As if that relationship negated any need for personal responsibility on his part. Mom, it wasn't a little out of hand. There were at least 30 people there. There's a cigarette burn on the coffee table, a stain on the futon, and a cracked bathroom mirror. The neighbor downstairs called me because the noise was so bad she couldn't sleep. He said he'll pay for any damages, my mother insisted, and he's really sorry. I'm sure he is, I said, trying to keep the sarcasm from my voice. He's always sorry after the fact, but being sorry doesn't fix the problem. The problem is that you've never given him a real chance, Ruby. You've always been so hard on him. Her words stung because they were so far from the truth. All I'd ever done was give Jake chances. Too many of them, according to Zoe. That's not fair, Mom. I've helped him countless times. I let him live in my apartment at a loss to myself. I adjusted the agreement to include his girlfriend when he moved her in without asking. I'm not being hard on him. I'm finally holding him accountable. My mother sighed heavily. Holding him accountable would be making him pay for the damages, not making him homeless. He won't be homeless, I said. He has 2 weeks to find another place, and if he can't, maybe he should come stay with you and Dad for a while. No, we don't have the space, my mother said, her voice tightening further. And your father's health hasn't been good. The stress would be too much. It was a low blow, using my father's health as leverage. He had high blood pressure, but it was well controlled with medication. Still, the implication was clear. If Jake had nowhere to go and something happened to my father as a result, it would be my fault. I'm sorry about Dad, I said, genuinely concerned. But my decision stands. Jake has 2 weeks to find a new place. Ruby, please reconsider. He's really trying this time. No, Mom, he's not, I said, my patience wearing thin. If he was really trying, he wouldn't have moved Amber in without asking. He wouldn't have thrown a party that trashed my apartment. He wouldn't have called you to intervene instead of taking responsibility for his actions. There was a long pause. On the other end of the line. When my mother spoke again, her voice was cold. I thought you were more compassionate than this, Ruby. I'm very disappointed. The words hit me like a slap. All my life, I'd strived to make my parents proud, to be the responsible one, the dependable one. And now, for standing up for myself, I was being told I lacked compassion. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said quietly. But my decision is final. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of my bed, phone still in hand, trying to process the conversation. I felt guilty for disappointing my mother, angry at Jake for putting me in this position once again, and frustrated that my parents couldn't see the pattern that was so obvious to me and Zoe. Eventually, I got up and started my day, pushing the family drama to the back of my mind as best I could. But as I was making coffee, my phone buzzed with a text from Jake. Real nice getting Mom involved. I thought we could handle this like adults. The hypocrisy was so absurd that I actually laughed out loud. I typed back, "You called her before." I did. Don't pretend otherwise. Jake. Whatever. We're looking for places, but everything's way more expensive than we thought. We might need more than 2 weeks. Me. The agreement says I only need to give you 72 hours notice. 2 weeks is generous. Jake. Come on, Ruby. Don't be like this. We're family. I stared at those last 3 words for a long time. Family. It was always the trump card, the emotional lever used to manipulate me into doing what Jake wanted, and it had worked for years, but not this time. Me. Family respects each other's boundaries and property. You have 2 weeks. I put my phone on silent and finished making my coffee, feeling both terrible and strangely liberated. For perhaps the first time in my life, I was enforcing a boundary with Jake and refusing to back down. Later that day, I drove to the Cedar Street apartment to assess the damage in daylight. Jake wasn't there. At work, presumably. But Amber was, half-heartedly cleaning up the remaining mess. "Oh, hi," she said when she opened the door, surprise evident on her face. "I didn't expect you today." "I need to see exactly what needs to be repaired," I said, stepping past her. In the harsh light of day, the damage was even more apparent. Besides the issues I'd noticed the night before, there were scuff marks on the walls, a broken dining chair, and what looked like lipstick on one of the couch pillows. I took photos of everything, making a detailed list of the repairs that would be needed. "We'll pay for everything," Amber said, hovering nervously as I worked. "Jake's taking extra shifts this week to make the money." "Good," I said, not looking up from my phone as I documented another cigarette burn, this one on the windowsill. "Look, I know you're mad," she continued, "and you have every right to be, but Jake really is trying to get his life together, and I'm helping him." I finally looked at her. How, exactly? By encouraging him to throw parties that damage property? By moving in without permission? Amber flinched. "That's not fair. The party was my fault, not Jake's. I was the one who invited too many people. And as for moving in, that just kind of happened. We didn't plan it." "That's the problem," I said. "Nothing is ever planned with Jake. It all just happens, and then other people have to deal with the consequences. He's not as irresponsible as you think," she insisted. "He works hard, he's saving money, and yet he's about to be apartment hunting again because he couldn't follow simple rules," I interrupted. "That doesn't sound like someone who's getting his life together." Amber's expression hardened. "You know, he said you've always been judgmental, but I gave you the benefit of the doubt." I guess he was right. The accusation stung, but I refused to let it show. I'm not being judgmental. I'm being realistic. And the reality is that you two have 2 weeks to find a new place to live. I finished documenting the damage and left, feeling Amber's glare burning into my back as I walked out. As I drove away, I wondered if she was right. Was I being too harsh? Too judgmental? But then I remembered the state of the apartment, the disregard for my property and my trust, and I knew I was making the right decision. It was time for Jake to learn that actions have consequences, even if that lesson made me the villain in his story. Over the next week, relations with Jake and Amber deteriorated further. Jake alternated between apologetic texts, promising to make things right, and angry ones accusing me of being cold and unforgiving. Amber unfollowed me on all social media platforms and posted passive-aggressive status updates that were clearly directed at me, though she never mentioned me by name. My mother called daily, each conversation more strained than the last. My father even got on the phone once, his quiet, "I'm disappointed in you, Ruby," somehow worse than all of my mother's more dramatic expressions of disapproval. I stood firm, but it wasn't easy. The weight of being the bad guy in my family's narrative was taking its toll. I found myself second-guessing my decision in quiet moments, wondering if I was overreacting, if I should just give Jake another chance. Zoe remained my steadfast supporter. "You're doing the right thing," she assured me over dinner at her place. "It's hard, but necessary." "Then why does it feel so awful?" I asked, pushing pasta around my plate without eating it. "Because you've been conditioned your whole life to put Jake's needs above your own," she said. "Breaking that pattern is painful, but it's also growth." I considered her words. Was that really the dynamic that had developed between Jake and me? Had I been enabling his immaturity all these years? "I just don't understand why my parents can't see it," I said. "Why they always take his side." Zoe shrugged. "Maybe because it's easier. They've created this dynamic where you're the responsible one who doesn't need help, and Jake's the one who always needs saving. Changing that narrative would mean admitting they've been handling things wrong all along." Her insight resonated with me. I'd never thought about it that way before, but it made sense. In our family's story, I was cast as the self-sufficient daughter who had everything together, while Jake was the struggling son who needed constant support and second chances. So what do I do? I asked. Just accept that I'm the villain in this story? No, Zoe said firmly. You write a new story, one where you're not the villain or the hero, but just a person with reasonable boundaries. And Jake isn't a victim or a villain either, but an adult who needs to take responsibility for his actions. Her advice stayed with me as I drove home that night. A new story. One where I wasn't defined solely by my relationship with Jake, where I could say no without being cruel, where I could prioritize my own needs without being selfish. It was a compelling vision, but implementing it would require breaking decades of family patterns, and that wouldn't happen overnight. The next day, I received a text from Jake that simply read, "We need to talk, in person." I was immediately wary. In person. Conversations with Jake had a way of turning emotional, with him using charm or guilt to get what he wanted. But avoiding him wouldn't solve anything. "Okay," I replied. "When and where?" We agreed to meet at a park near the Cedar Street apartment the following afternoon. It was a public place where we'd be less likely to raise our voices or cause a scene. Arrived to find Jake already there, sitting on a bench, looking more put together than he had in weeks. His hair was neatly combed, and he was wearing a button-up shirt instead of his usual t-shirt. "Thanks for coming," he said as I sat beside him, maintaining a careful distance. "What did you want to talk about?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Jake took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about the party, and moving Amber in without asking, and everything." I nodded but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "You were right," he said, surprising me. "I violated our agreement. I took advantage of your generosity, and I'm sorry." His apology seemed genuine, which made me suspicious. Jake was rarely this straightforward about his mistakes unless he wanted something. "Thank you for acknowledging that," I said cautiously. "Amber and I found a place," he continued. "It's not as nice as your apartment, and it's a bit further from work, but it's what we can afford right now. We're moving out this weekend, ahead of your deadline." This was unexpected news. I'd been prepared for him to ask for more time, not tell me he was leaving early. "That's good," I said. "I'm glad you found something." Jake nodded, looking down at his hands. "I also wanted to say that I understand why you made the decision you did. It wasn't just about the party. It was about a pattern, right? Me taking advantage, you cleaning up my messes." His insight caught me off guard. This didn't sound like the Jake I knew, the one who deflected responsibility and played the victim. "Yes," I said simply. "That's exactly it." "I've been thinking about that pattern a lot," he continued, "about why I keep repeating it. And I realized something. I've always been jealous of you, Ruby." "Jealous?" I echoed, surprised. "Of what?" "Of everything. Your success, your confidence, the way you've always known exactly what you wanted and gone after it. I've never had that kind of clarity or drive." His confession left me momentarily speechless. All these years, I'd thought Jake's behavior stemmed from entitlement or laziness. It had never occurred to me that jealousy might be at the root of it. "I didn't know," I said finally. "How could you?" I never said anything. Instead, I just acted out, took advantage, made you the bad guy whenever you tried to hold me accountable." He glanced up at me, his expression contrite. "It wasn't fair to you?" I felt a lump forming in my throat. This was the most honest conversation Jake and I had had in years, maybe ever. "Thank you for saying that," I managed. "I'm not asking you to forgive me or to change your mind about us moving out," Jake said quickly. "We're still going. I just wanted you to know that I understand why things happened the way they did, and I don't blame you for it." I nodded, processing his words. It was strange to see Jake taking responsibility for his actions without being forced to do so. Strange, but encouraging. "What about Mom and Dad?" I asked. "They've been pretty upset with me." Jake grimaced. "Yeah, I know. And that's partly my fault too. I may have exaggerated some things when I first called them. Made it sound like you were being unreasonable. And now?" I told them the truth yesterday. About the party, about moving Amber in without permission, all of it. They're still processing, I think. But they understand better now why you reacted the way you did. Relief washed over me. The strain with my parents had been one of the hardest parts of this whole ordeal. "Thank you for doing that," I said sincerely. Jake shrugged. It was the right thing to do. Finally. We sat in silence for a moment, the autumn breeze rustling the leaves around us. It felt like a shift had occurred between us, subtle but significant. "So what now?" I asked eventually. "For you and Amber, I mean." "We're going to make the new place work," Jake said. "I picked up some extra shifts at the bar, and Amber's looking for a second job. It'll be tight for a while, but we'll manage." "And in the long term?" Jake smiled slightly. "I've been thinking about that too. I'm looking into certification programs for bartending and mixology. Turns out you can make pretty good money if you specialize, especially at higher-end establishments." "That sounds promising," I said, genuinely pleased to hear he was thinking about career advancement. "It's a start," he agreed. "And Amber's been talking about going back to school for nursing. We're both realizing we need to think beyond just the next paycheck, you know?" I nodded, feeling a cautious optimism. This was a different Jake than the one I was used to. More reflective, more forward-thinking. "I'm glad to hear that," I said. "I really do want things to work out for you, Jake. Despite everything." "I know," he said softly. "You've always been in my corner, Ruby, even when I didn't deserve it." The lump in my throat grew. "You're my brother," I said simply, the phrase taking on a new meaning now, not an obligation or a burden, but a simple statement of connection. Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And you're my sister. One who deserves better than what I've given her." We parted ways soon after, with a promise to talk again once he and Amber were settled in their new place. As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter somehow, as if a weight I'd been carrying for years had been partially lifted. I knew one conversation wouldn't change everything. Jake had made promises before, shown glimpses of maturity before, only to fall back into old patterns. But something about this interaction felt different, more authentic, more like a beginning than an end. Maybe Zoe was right. Maybe we were writing a new story, Jake and I. One where we could both grow and change, not locked into the roles we'd played for so long. I sent Zoe a text as I drove home. "Just had the most honest conversation with Jake ever. Tell you about it later." Her response came quickly. "Proud of you both." As I navigated the familiar streets back to my apartment, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps this difficult chapter with Jake might lead to something better for both of us. Not an instant fix, but the start of a healthier relationship. One built on mutual respect rather than obligation and resentment. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was progress. And for now, that was enough. The weekend came, and with it, moving day for Jake and Amber. I'd decided to be present for the process, partly to ensure my property was treated respectfully and partly to help bridge the new understanding Jake. And I had reached in the park. I arrived at the Cedar Street apartment early Saturday morning to find Jake already loading boxes into a rented pickup truck. Amber was inside, wrapping dishes in newspaper and packing them carefully. "Need any help?" I offered, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Jake looked surprised but nodded. "Sure. There are some boxes in the bedroom that need to go down." I spent the next few hours helping them move, our conversation stilted at first, but gradually becoming more natural. Amber remained somewhat cool toward me, but she was civil, which was all I could really expect given the circumstances. As the last of their belongings were loaded into the truck, I did a walkthrough of the apartment with Jake, documenting the existing damage that would need to be repaired. "I'll get the futon cleaned professionally," he promised, looking at the stain that had resisted their attempts to remove it. "And I've already ordered a replacement mirror for the bathroom." "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate that." We stood in the middle of the empty living room, an awkward silence falling between us. "So," Jake said finally, "I guess this is it." I nodded. "I guess so." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the apartment keys. "Here. Thanks for everything. Not just the apartment, but for trying to help me, even when I didn't make it easy." I took the keys, our fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "You're welcome, and good luck with the new place, with everything." Jake surprised me by pulling me into a hug, something we rarely did as adults. "I'm going to do better, Ruby. I promise." I hugged him back, hoping his words would prove true this time. "I know you will." After they left, I spent some time in the empty apartment, assessing what would need to be done before I could rent it out again. The damage from the party was significant, but not catastrophic. With professional cleaning and a few repairs, the place would be back in shape within a week or two. As I locked up and prepared to leave, I felt a mix of emotions: relief that the ordeal was over, satisfaction that I'd held my ground, and a cautious hope for Jake's future. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, and perhaps in the long run, it would prove beneficial for both of us. Over the next few weeks, Jake stayed true to his word. The futon was professionally cleaned, the mirror replaced, and the cigarette burns repaired. He even transferred money to cover the other minor damages before I had a chance to ask for it. My parents gradually came around as well. My mother called one day to apologize for her reaction, admitting that she'd been unfair to me. "Jake told us everything," she said. "And your father and I have been talking. We've probably enabled his behavior over the years, made excuses for him when we should have held him accountable." The admission stunned me. "It's okay, Mom. We all did what we thought was best." "Yes, but you were right this time. And I'm sorry for making you feel like the bad guy for standing up for yourself." Her apology meant more to me than I could express. For so long, I'd felt like the outsider in my own family, the one whose feelings and boundaries were secondary to Jake's needs. To have my mother acknowledge that dynamic, even in a small way, was healing. Meanwhile, I focused on getting the apartment ready to rent again. I hired professional cleaners, had the necessary repairs done, and even updated a few things that had been on my to-do list for a while. New kitchen faucet, fresh paint in the bathroom, better lighting fixtures. When it was finished, the apartment looked better than it had in years. I listed it on a few rental websites and was pleasantly surprised by the immediate interest. Within a week, I had multiple applications from potential tenants. One application stood out: a nursing student named Maya who was looking for a quiet place close to the hospital where she did her clinical rotations. Her references were impeccable, her credit score excellent, and during our brief meeting, she struck me as responsible and mature. "I'm usually either studying or at the hospital," she told me, "so you don't have to worry about parties or noise." I smiled at that, appreciating her directness. "That sounds perfect." Maya moved in at the beginning of the next month, signing a 1-year lease that included all the protections and stipulations I'd learned were necessary. The rent she agreed to was actually higher than what I could have asked Jake to pay, putting the property firmly back in the asset column of my financial picture. As for Jake and Amber, they seemed to be making their new place work. Jake texted me occasionally with updates. He'd gotten a certification in craft cocktails. Amber had started prerequisites for nursing school. They were both working extra hours to build up savings. One day, about 2 months after they'd moved out, Jake invited me to dinner at their new apartment. It was smaller than mine, in a less desirable neighborhood, but they'd made it cozy and personal. Amber had even warmed up to me somewhat, showing me around with pride and serving a surprisingly delicious home-cooked meal. "We're making it work," Jake told me over dessert. "It's tight sometimes, but we're learning to budget better." "I'm really proud of you both," I said, meaning it. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey of the past few months. What had started as a reluctant favor to my brother had turned into a watershed moment in our relationship. By finally enforcing a boundary, by saying no when every family pattern pushed me to say yes, I had inadvertently created space for both of us to grow. Jake was taking steps toward genuine independence and responsibility. I was learning that standing firm didn't make me cruel or uncaring. And our relationship, while still a work in progress, felt more honest and balanced than it ever had before. Zoe, of course, took some credit for this transformation. "I told you so," she said smugly when I updated her on Jake's progress. "Sometimes, the most caring thing you can do is not rescue someone." I know, I conceded with a laugh. "You were right all along." "I usually am," she teased. "But seriously, Ruby, I'm proud of you. Standing up to family is one of the hardest things to do." She was right about that. It had been hard, painfully so at times, but it had also been worth it. The Cedar Street apartment, which had briefly been a source of stress and conflict, was now a symbol of something important: my willingness to protect what I'd built, to value my own efforts and investments. Maya was proving to be an ideal tenant, quiet and reliable, paying her rent on time and taking good care of the property. And Jake? Well, Jake was finally facing the consequences of his actions and making different choices as a result. It was too soon to say whether these changes would last, but for the first time in our adult lives, I felt genuinely hopeful about his future. As for me, I was learning that being the responsible one didn't have to mean being the one who always gave in, who always sacrificed, who always put others' needs above my own. True responsibility meant having the courage to establish and maintain healthy boundaries, even when doing so was difficult or unpopular. It was a lesson I wished I'd learned years ago, but I was grateful to have learned it now. Better late than never, as my mother would say. And speaking of my mother, she called me one evening with news that confirmed the shift in our family dynamic. "Your cousin Melissa called," she told me. "She's having some trouble with her roommate and was wondering if she could stay with your father and me for a while." In the past, my mother would have agreed without hesitation, then potentially asked me to help out financially or otherwise. But this time, she continued, "I told her we don't have the space, and it wouldn't be appropriate. She needs to work things out with her roommate or find her own solution." I was momentarily speechless. That's great, Mom. I think that was the right call." "Well," she said, a smile in her voice, "I learned from watching you stand your ground with Jake. Sometimes the kindest thing isn't the easiest thing." Her words warmed me, evidence that the ripples from my decision extended beyond just Jake and me. Perhaps our entire family was learning to relate to each other in healthier ways. As autumn turned to winter and the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had begun with that phone call from my mother about Jake needing a place to stay. What had seemed like a simple favor had become a catalyst for change, a turning point in relationships that had been stuck in unhealthy patterns for decades. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of guilt, of wondering if I was doing the right thing. But standing in my Cedar Street apartment one day, checking on a minor repair before Maya returned from a clinical rotation, I knew without question that I had made the right choice. The apartment was peaceful now, a place of order and calm. The property had increased in value, both monetarily and in terms of the lessons it had taught me. And somewhere across town, Jake was building his own life, facing his own challenges, making his own decisions, not as my perpetual responsibility, but as my brother, separate but connected, independent but family. It was, I realized, the way things should have been all along.